Welcome everyone to today's session. I'm delighted to be introducing and chairing today's subject, a very urgent and important subject of the board's role in promoting equality, specifically race equality and good governance. We know that boards need to improve with their own diversity and to build open and inclusive cultures at board level to successfully address health inequalities. So the format for the session today is we will shortly be hearing from each of our esteemed panel speakers on their perspective on race equality and governance. We will then have plenty of time for a Q&A discussion, so please submit your questions. I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Lord Simon Woolley, a peer in the House of Lords and former chair of the government's Race Disparity Unit Advisory Group.
Manisha, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and for the listeners and the viewers out there. The backdrop behind me is my college at Cambridge University. It's called Homerton, and so if you've got kids that want to aspire to do great things, send them to me, please. We want to nurture academic excellence, but we want more than that. We want to ensure that we help and nurture good citizens to do extraordinary things in the world. But thank you for this opportunity. I don't know how many people we're speaking to. I'm hoping lots. And I can't see you, so I need to feel you. I need to feel your presence, because otherwise I'm just speaking to a screen. So the question we have today: what is the board's role in promoting equality, race equality as good governance? I would argue there's another question before answering that one, and that is why? Why should we be promoting race equality? Why is race equality an aspect of good governance? And I would take us back, if you don't mind, to 2 years ago, in the time of the raging pandemic, and of course the death of George Floyd. It was a difficult, challenging time, globally, nationally, locally, all those things. And what struck many of us, particularly many of you on the front line of dealing with the pandemic, was a number of factors, not least the disproportionality of Black and brown faces dying almost right in front of us. And I guess for some of you, literally. I was struck by it as an activist and quickly felt, what's going on? Why are we dying? And not just those in healthcare, bus drivers, security guards, cleaners. And for me, if you joined the dots and looked at where people were dying, you saw something very profound. In all the areas where people were dying, you saw systemic race inequality within the NHS, within the health system more broadly, those doctors without protective clothing, those vulnerable or front-facing COVID-19 without the right protection, overly exposed. And then there were those in other jobs that were overly exposed: bus drivers, security guards, cleaners, porters. And it screamed to me, this was a wake-up call, not only a wake-up call of the existing fault lines of race inequality, but exacerbated by this deadly disease. And then, of course, we had George Floyd's murder. And at that juncture, all of you will remember that in some quarters, we had, I would argue, the greatest conversations on race inequality ever had. I know that sounds like a hyperbole, but I think it's true. Some of the most uncomfortable conversations that our nation has ever had about systemic race inequality. And the NHS didn't have to look far. They looked around, they looked at their senior management, their very senior management, and said, my God, the NHS is the jewel in the nation's public sector crown, predicated on no small measure by the efforts of Black and brown people. And when you look at the top, when you look at middle management, it's spot the Black or brown person. It was a wake-up call. And I know that many of you said, it's now time to act. It's now time to give real equality, real opportunity. We think we're doing good, but have a look who's dying. Have a look who's in charge. Have a look who gets promoted. That happened in the NHS. It happened in big business. It happened at my university. It happened right across the piece. And I thought to myself, out of this madness, out of this tragedy, we could be on a journey that we will look back in decades' time and say, as awful as it was, we acted in a dramatic way. And I thought we were going along that trajectory until we had a government in denial. And when the hundreds of thousands of Black and white kids took to the streets for Black Lives Matter, and the government capitulated and said, we'll have a report, the SEWL, or as many of you call it, the sewage report, we were presented not with a set of solutions that would be transformative, but a report full of not only race equality denials, but saying to people like me, many like you, it's your own fault for dying, your DNA, your poor diets. You've never had it so good. It's like you're on the floor and getting kicked. And now with the draft report of the COVID-19 public inquiry, race is not there. Whitewashed. Denial. So, what is the board's role in promoting race equality is the question. That is down to every single one of you. You can put your head in the sand, you can buy the government's line, or you can follow the evidence, follow your heart, and be the change that the NHS needs. Be the driver that our society needs. Be the hope that our children demand. That's on you. That's on me. That's on all of us. This conference, this governance conference that you are taking part in the next couple of days, I would say to you that this is a chance for you to look in the mirror, to have a long, hard look and say, I know there are detractors, I know there are naysayers, I know there are deniers, and those that would want to take us back to the 1950s. But I ask myself but one question. What's my role? And when you do that, and you feel the spirit of, I don't know, Dr. Martin Luther King, I'm a disciple of him. But you feel something. What is my role? What difference can I make? I don't feel burdened by that. I feel super empowered. I feel the superpowers just come out, and I just start running. I start doing, I start taking people along. We start making a difference. That's on us. Let's have the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Woolley. Thank you so much. You've left us with a lot to think about. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Sim Skavaza, who is a non-executive director at Imperial College Healthcare NHS Trust, and was also a deputy chair executive at Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and Berkshire West Integrated Care System.
Thank you very much, Manisha. I now have the unenviable task of following Simon's call to arms, as it were, and that context giving that I think we need before we delve into the detail, which is so common in the NHS. So I want to pick up on something that Simon alluded to, and that was the trigger for the momentum that we've got in this anti-racism work, and that was the George Lloyd effect. And I use the word trigger because it seemed to trigger a mass consciousness in all of us, in people that perhaps hadn't really thought about racism or race before in that way. It really played on our emotional connection to the world and to others. And it was almost as if we held those visceral, horrible images in our hand, on our phones. They were with us, they couldn't be ignored. And what struck me at the time was how businesses and institutions took on the mantle. There were calls to action. There were statements of intent from people and places that perhaps we'd never heard from before in terms of this. All of a sudden, people realize that there's a moral obligation here to do this work. You can't make money out of people's misery. We have to try and fix this. And I think there have been movements before, and there will be movements again. And each movement has its moment. And I think ours is now. I think the time is right. I think momentum is with us. I think the door is ajar. And what it's going to take, I believe, is everyone, as Lord Woolley says, to take on responsibility for making the change. However small that may be, it's down to each and every one of us. And then collectively, we can start moving the dial. I think the challenge is not to let the momentum slip. It's in our grasp and we need to move. I think when we think about organisations, we have the data, we have the evidence, we know the res, you know how many NEDs, ethnic minority NEDs, are on your boards. We know how many ethnic minority chairs exist within the NHS, not enough still. We know the data, we know where things aren't working. We mustn't use the data to become trapped in looking for 1% increase improvements. You get stuck. You've got to keep your eye on the main picture, I believe, on the culture of the organisation that you're working in. The race conversation needs to be embedded. And for me, embedding means having conversations at audit committee about race and how we measure and monitor the progress that trusts are making within race. I think, the measure of success for me is when you've got your audit chair or your chair of finance talking about race and race inequality within their committee meetings. When you talk and demand your suppliers, our manufacturers, to have statements of intent and to show their credentials around race, their social responsibility around gender. These are the sorts of things that we need to demand in order to change the dial. As far as I'm concerned, it's engagement. It's having the conversation in the first place. Lots of boards find that difficult, but we have to have the conversation and we have to create the space, the safe space to have the conversation. But then we have to focus on the issue and bring it up constantly and talk about it constantly so that it becomes a natural part of our daily business. We can't allow the financial and operational pressures that trusts are feeling to move and squeeze this agenda out of the way. We can't do this. We have to assure ourselves that there's absolute impact. All of the actions, everything that your trusts are doing, there must be an impact. And then we need to check that impact with the staff themselves. Do you feel it? Can you feel the change? Do you feel supported? Have we made a difference? Do you even know what we're doing to try and move the dial? These are the sorts of questions that boards need to ask themselves and the staff when they go on the ward visits. The thing is, the NHS is obligated to do this work. I was drawn to the fact that in the NHS Constitution, the first principle is about compassion. And the NHS's wider social responsibility to treat everyone equally. It's in the NHS People Plan. It's in the London Workforce Racist Strategy. It's not as if everything that we're talking about here today isn't anchored and rooted back in everything the NHS believes in. It's part of who the NHS is. It's our culture. It's a culture of compassion, of about caring for people of colour. I think there are certain elements that boards need to deal with if they're to tackle this agenda successfully. And that has to be demonstrable leadership. You have to show your true colours. And I think of Chris and I think of Saffron entering this conversation. And they've been accused, NHS providers, of being late to the party. Well, yes, they might be, but at least they showed up. Everyone needs a chance to be able to do their thing, however long it takes them to come to the conclusion. It's absolutely right. I think of the chair of the chief executive at Imperial, Tim Orchard, who it's his mission to sort the race agenda out within our trust at Imperial. I then think about accountability. There has to be accountability, calling ourselves into question, calling the trust into question, calling the leadership into question. What do we think? How are we doing? Are we making a difference? Does this work? And if it doesn't work, scrap it. Concentrate on the few things that you know can make a difference. Granular data, robust granular data. Stop lumping everybody together. We need to look at the different cohorts, the different ethnicities, and the way that discrimination plays out in their particular experience. It's really important. And of course, role models. People have got to be able to look around and see successful people, ethnic minorities, people of colour, all sorts of people just being promoted, being accepted, being listened to. And of course, effective communication. Does your trust know exactly how you feel about racism? Is there an anti-racist statement? Is there something physical and something written and something publicly expressed that your staff, yourself, and your public, your patients can look at and say, right, I understand what sort of trust this is. I feel safe coming here. Yes, not everything's going to be right, but that doesn't mean to say you can't state your intent publicly, explicitly, with the words anti-racist strong and clear. So I went on the London Res workforce training, and that was delivered by Inspiring Hope. It was some of the best training, 3-day course. And they told us about the 3 R's: reflect, rethink, revise. Now, this is something that all leaders have to go through. However competent, confident you are, we need to unpick the things that have been taught to us from time immemorial. Otherwise, this doesn't work. It's the personal journey that we make that will affect the collective organisational journey that will change the dial and improve the work experience for all of our staff, especially our staff from ethnic minorities. Remember, this work is not a tick box, it's not a project, it's not a programme. It's a cultural push for better inclusion and better treatment of people, staff and patients alike. We are all complicit in perpetuating race inequalities through our silence and our inaction. And actually, it's time we stood up. It's time that everybody said something, did something, acted as an active ally. Even if it's difficult, it requires courage. It does. It requires courage, it requires commitment, and it requires energy. And that has to be personal and organisational alike. Otherwise, nothing will change. So thank you. I find it very, very exciting to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&As.
Thank you, Sim. Some great tangible experiences from you and a call to action I hear as well. I'd like to now introduce our third speaker, who is Lorraine Sanduza. She is the Chief Nurse at East London NHS Foundation Trust.
Thank you. Really hard to follow, actually, and I echo everything that's been said before. I suppose equalities is something for me that, interestingly, there is a lot of talking about it. And as we've heard, there was a real shift and the noise got louder, particularly watching the murder of George Floyd. And it didn't start there, it just amplified it. And for those who experience racism, it was like, this is what we've been talking about. There was a real call to action and a real swell of energy that came with that. However, if you're truly going to make any changes, you have to be willing and be committed to sticking with it. If I look at myself in terms of my role now, being chief nurse in a trust, and I'm also deputy chief exec, my support and growth started years ago. So this is not something that people can change overnight, and it's not something that you can do as a tick box. I think as a board, it all starts at the top. You have to have the conversation and really challenge each other about our commitment. Is it we're saying what people want to hear, or do we follow through with our action? In relation to equality, is there a thread of it in absolutely everything that we do? Do we look at all our challenges and our issues through the race equality lens? If we think now we're all dealing with waiting lists, have we interrogated that data to see who are we leaving behind? Who is being most impacted? And if we're going to work differently, who is going to be impacted by that? Particularly the groups where we're not really meeting their needs. How is this new thing that we're going to do to improve? How is that going to support them? There's something about being comfortable with the ugliness of this. So hearing people's stories about the real impact of living while Black, while Asian in this country, and then thinking about the impact of working while Black or ethnic minority. When the murder of George Floyd happened, I remember feeling the anger. I was really angry. I was really upset. It was so difficult to watch, but I sat there and I watched it all. I then came to work and I said I was going to have a session and provide it through our BME network. And some questions were about what will you say? We don't have the answers, but to me, it's like, it's not about having the answers. It's about sitting and hearing how people feel, but also getting an idea of what are the things that we need to do to change this. There was a real realization about racism is not always just about people calling you the N-word. It's also the microaggressions, the little things that happen every day that remind you that you are not white. And we had what we call race and privilege sessions, where staff across the trust were talking about the experience of living as an ethnic minority. And for the first time, colleagues heard stories that nurses, professional people on their way to work are late for a shift because they've been stopped and searched. And that is a common experience, but they don't necessarily talk about it at work. You're told you're late, you apologize for being late, and then you go about your business. Talking about being followed in shops, talking about always there's an assumption that you're doing something wrong, or the signaling that you do not belong. And then thinking with all of that experience just of life, what version of yourself do you bring to work? Do you have to assimilate so that people can relate to you more? Do you have to change who you are? Do you have to rub a bit of your culture and the core of your being just to fit in, just to be accepted? So having to wear two hats and being in the group that's more likely to be assaulted by patients, less likely to have the power to change anything. If you think about working from home, which groups could never have worked from home? Being disciplined, being suspended, and being fired, being referred to professional bodies. Which groups constantly feature within that list? So there's a fear and an anxiety. And within that, you're less likely to be comfortable and confident and give your best self, which in turn benefits our service users. If you think about the reason why we're all here, there's something about, as leaders, recognizing that this is everybody's business. And it's not just the business and the fight for the people who are directly impacted by it. Yes, there's something about listening to people, because I bring myself and my experience to my role, but I don't own this agenda. And it's not just for me to fix. And giving it in the same level of attention that we give to patient safety, to all the other things that we do. So looking at that through that lens. Staff networks are extremely vital. So years ago, we had our networks that were led by an executive, and they were not great spaces. They were not well attended or well known. So we thought maybe we need to do something different. So what we said is all the networks have an executive lead and you're still accountable, but then you have a network lead who is a member of staff and they have tenures like every 2 years. And that the network agenda is driven by the network, and that the network is not only our support, and you've got like a focus group that you can speak to and work through improving, but also they challenge us. They don't own this agenda, and it's not their responsibility to fix it. They help us to fix it. And constantly, that's something we all have to watch to make sure we remind ourselves that we as the leaders of the trust are the ones who are responsible for this agenda. There's also something about how you tie together your patient's experience and your staff experience, because our patients and our staff come from the same communities and the battles that they face in life are the same. However, when they get to our services, the power thing comes in place and they're further impacted when they're using our service. But there's something about how you have that as one conversation and how you have the race impact as part of everything that you do, as Sim had said. We've been thinking about how to become a trauma-informed organization. And in terms of trauma-informed care, we started with our service users, our patients, thinking about the trauma and the impact of life events and how that impacts you and then comes out maybe through your presentation, and how can we model ourselves and make sure that our clinical interventions are aware of that. But then the same applies to our staff in terms of what we've all globally have gone through with COVID. But then thinking about those reminders, particularly when we started seeing all the people who were dying of COVID, and a stark picture was being shown. And I remember being in a conversation with people, and they're like, oh, maybe it's like low-paid staff, and so there's something about exposure, but actually we saw more senior staff, but there was something that was very obvious about what most of them had in common. So it truly showed that something was not right. And then that thing, particularly also with the vaccination, that there's something with that community that we just need to fix them. And if we fix them, then everything would work better. Finally, I think there's something about when you're tackling the issues related to race and racism, thinking about how you approach other things. We've just started pursuing equity program using QI methodology, because quality improvement has helped us in other ways. So making that how we work relating to race being the same as how we work related to all the other things that we're working on. And I suppose my final thing is just to say, I always say, don't write strategy that your behavior can't cash. And that's because it's very easy to write a strategy and put strong intentional words as to what you'll do, but you can always shelve that and then do nothing about it. So there's something about everything we write. We need to be thinking, what do we need to do? How do we need to change? What should our behaviors be like to be able to absolutely address that? Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. There's some really significant, important points there about listening to the experience of Black and Brown communities, including staff, and how trauma impacts everybody. Before we go to our final panel speaker, I'd just like to remind everybody to submit questions for our Q&A. Our fourth and final speaker is Chris Hobson, Chief Executive of NHS Providers.
Thanks, Manisha, and thanks very, very much indeed to Lorraine, Sim and Simon. I think some really, really powerful points. Let me just start off by kind of saying, and Sim referred to it, and thank you to the work that both she and Manisha have been doing and their colleague Majid to help us on our journey, is this is a hard journey. I did a blog about a month and a half, 2 months ago, where I said, I think it's the most difficult thing I think I've done in my career. And I think lots of us, I think, are absolutely in the same place as, hopefully we all are in the same place that Lorraine, Sim and Simon are about the importance of this. I just observe that I've not found it easy, but in terms of not really knowing exactly what things I should be doing as the chief executive, but also kind of finding, the language and the concepts difficult. And I suppose I would observe that and I observed this in the blog, that as a 59-year-old, I would have, and a white 59-year-old, I would observe that our younger staff seem to much more reflexively engage with this agenda and seem to much more reflexively understand exactly what's needed and the language and concepts to use. So I think hopefully many of you will know that we've been doing some really important work, not just as an organisation ourselves, but really trying to assist you on your trust board to make progress on this agenda. And we're calling it Race 2.0, Time for Real Change. What I thought I'd do is just play back to you what you've told us in terms of where you think you are on this journey, because I think there's some quite interesting information here and some insight. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So where's this data come from? It's come from a combination of 3 different things. One is we've been talking to our colleagues at EI and the Leadership Academy, the Race and Health Observatory and the King's Fund. We did a series of qualitative, in-depth interviews with chairs, chief executives and NEDs, deliberately 2/3 from an ethnic minority background. And then we've also done a member survey in which we had 254 responses from 134 trusts. That's 63% of our membership. And again, it was aimed at chairs, CEOs and NEDs. And what we were trying to really identify is, where are boards now on these issues? Where has most progress been made and where are the gaps? And what do boards think they need to do next? So next slide is a kind of summary. So we asked people, where would you describe yourself on your current journey on race equality on a scale of 1 to 10, where 0 is very early in your journey and 10 is race equality fully embedded in your work. And again, it's probably not a massively surprising response, but basically it was interesting to us that most trust leaders felt they were midway in their journey, but intriguingly, only 4% of people felt that race equality is fully embedded as a core part of the board's business. And I think we'd also observe that having 18% in the 0 to 3 category really does reflect that there are some people who are really very much at the start of their journey. So next slide, the next area that we were exploring were, where do you feel you've made the most progress on race equality? And again, I thought this was a really interesting set of results. So I think definitely 85% of people feeling there's increased leadership on staff networks, 63% feeling that they've made good progress on building a more diverse board, 58% feeling they'd prioritised inclusive leadership development, 54% a clear strategy and plan on race equality, 42% actions to increase leadership accountability on race equality. But just interestingly, again, where do people feel they perhaps made least progress? 32% of people feeling race equality was really properly embedded and incorporated into the board's assurance framework. I won't go through all of the other kind of details on the slide, and we'll make these slides available if you haven't already seen them. On the workforce side, though, again, interesting about people feeling they've made better progress on improving well-being and improving workforce data, but actually significantly less progress on things that we know are really important to people, like promotion, like performance management and appraisal, and also retention. And again, I thought all three of the previous people were really, really powerful for me about, the reason as to why this is important. It's important because it's very clear that a significant section of our workforce is telling us they can't give of their best because of the racism inherent in the NHS. And exactly as, again, others were saying, we've got a duty to ensure not only that all of our staff are able to give it their best, but we can also provide the right quality of care to all of the people who pay for the NHS through their taxes and who use it as citizens. And again, it's very clear that we're not doing that in terms of BAME patients saying that they don't feel they're getting what they need from the NHS in the same extent to which people from a white background say they are. So next slide. What's helped? This was the question we asked. I think what was interesting was people saying to us they absolutely recognise the importance of the data, but actually what they felt was that focusing on hearts and minds change, including getting closer to the lived experience of ethnic minority staff and service users, had made a real difference. A real sense, as we've heard already, that tapping into existing and staff networks and creating new ones as a key part of that listening and understanding process was important. Whole board development sessions, as we're saying, not just treating this as a one-off, but part of an ongoing program of developing the board and having the difficult conversations about race discrimination. And crucially, I think, and we see this in a number of different areas, but what sometimes happens is that particularly important issues, digital would be a very good example, is that in some places this is sort of, ghettoized as a kind of responsibility of one individual person, as opposed to seeing that actually, if you want to make progress in this area, it's got to be not just the responsibility and accountability of an EDI lead or a director of workforce, but genuinely an integral part of all board portfolios and the board as a whole. Next slide, please. So what were the key challenges? Again, I think we've heard some of these. The burden of responsibility to lead being placed on ethnic minority board members as opposed to everybody stepping up and recognising it's their responsibility. Lack of buy-in, some boards engaged intellectually but not emotionally. Discomfort and lack of confidence around race, fear of saying the wrong thing. We've already talked about that. Low awareness and understanding of structural and systemic race issues. And again, that's something that we particularly feel is important for people to recognise. And again, I wouldn't quite use Simon's language, but as you know, publicly, we expressed our real disappointment with the Sewell report and its failure to recognise and acknowledge the structural and systemic race issues here. Not attracting diverse leaders, little proactive work to develop the ethnic minority talent pipeline. And it's one thing that I feel as Chief Executive of NHS Providers, I've definitely failed on. We do not have a diverse director team, and that is something that we are thinking really carefully about how we address. Frustration, I think, at the lack of impact, despite instigating a range of initiatives. Lack of knowledge of who to approach and of evidence-based interventions with proven success. And I think, again, a need for greater understanding of the linkages between race and wider health inequalities and intersectionality. So that's what you played back to us as the key challenges. Next slide, please. We asked you, how can we help? Again, I won't dwell on this side, but we've really heard back from you really pretty clearly that where you'd like us to focus is evidence-based case studies, learning from best practice in other sectors, and what sort of questions should boards and governors be asking in these spaces. So that is something that we will be focusing on as we go forward. And then the next slide, please, which is the final slide, is I think we tried to distill all of this into sort of three kind of key requirements for real change. I think the first was hearts and minds change. How do we create more safe spaces and commit to having the difficult conversations that draw on the data and the personal testimony? How do we promote the concept of each individual being an instrument for change and each individual being able to proactively challenge structural racism? This is a contact sport. Yep, this is not something where you can stand on the sidelines and think it's an intellectual exercise. You personally, each of us need to engage. Clearly taking an important part of that is confidence and capability to act. What is the evidence on what really does work, and people being able to identify that for their particular context. Peer learning sessions on how do we actually do this with a relentless focus on outcomes, signposting to wider resources, other support offers and networks, so that actually as we take part in the contact sport, we really understand what it is that we individually need to do. And then the third area is really about taking accountability. How do you really embed race equality at the heart of the board's business? How do you ensure that progress is properly evaluated and reported? And what are the questions you should be asking as a board to ensure that the entire organisation for which you're responsible is doing what it should be doing in terms of embedding race equality? So hopefully you found that helpful as a kind of sense of where people think you are at the moment, where you think you are at the moment, and what it is that you need to do going forward. Thanks, Manisha.
Thank you, Chris. A lot of information there from the data that you've gathered and some key points. I'd really like to now move on to our Q&A. And as we're waiting for questions to come in, I'd like to ask our panel about something that I've heard in all of your discussions. Simon spoke about the why. Why is this important? And Chris, you've just shared that there is some lack of understanding and low awareness. And Sim raised the point about revising, reflecting and rethinking. So what I've noticed, and Chris, I think you probably share this as well, is sometimes there's a lack of acceptance of the truth of the impact of systemic racism at board level. I've observed data that comes to board stories, which are sanitised or set pieces. And Lorraine spoke about the actual real life effects of trauma and how that affects Black and brown staff and communities. So I guess my question to you, firstly, as a panel is, how do we really bring a true picture into the board space so they really know what the reality of what's happening in their space is, both for their staff and their patients of colour?
Well,
you go, Chris.
No, well, just very, very quickly. I mean, I just think you've got to do it. As I said, that's what I mean by a contact sport. I think you've absolutely got to engage with this personally and listen and really seek to understand. And there's no shortcuts to that. Dido Harding said to me that the single most powerful thing that she felt she and David Pryor did 2 years ago was to literally spend 2 hours with a group of BAME staff and literally just sit there and listen and not try and excuse, exactly as you say, Manisha, not try and sanitize, but to actually listen and understand what had gone on. And she described it as a genuinely transformational experience. And certainly that's my experience of having done the same thing. And there's no shortcut. You absolutely do need to do it.
Thank you, Chris. I think, Sim, did you want to come in as well?
Yes, I just want to echo what Chris has said. And, you know, it's the listening part, but the really listening and hearing, and the staff networks, as Lorraine said, is where they're at. So as chair of the People Committee at Imperial, every committee, we have a staff story that comes to the committee. And we are trying to concentrate on the protected characteristics at the moment. And then following that staff story, we then invite the chair of the equivalent network to come and give a presentation as well. And what I'm quite proud of at Imperial is it's picking staff stories that don't necessarily show the trust in its best light. So they are stories of struggle and bad experience, and we sit and listen, and we thank the bravery of the people that agree to come and speak to us, and we try and learn. We learn from the mistakes, we learn about what we need to do next. So that's really, really powerful. And that sets the scene for the rest of the meeting, really, because it's the effect on our people that really care. And the second thing is there are other networks as well. I'm a member of something called the Seacole Group. It's about 140 chairs from ethnic minorities and NEDs, and it's safe space. It's space where we support, encourage, and investigate, and talk about the reality of the racism within our structure, the NHS and our trusts. And I'm afraid it still exists. And it's there, and I know there's some progress that's being made, but it's not enough. So networks become hyper important in terms of listening. And then the ward visits, go and talk to the staff. They'll tell you everything you need to know without compunction. So as a board member, you have to get out to site. You have to talk to our patients and our staff. That's where you'll find out.
Thank you, Sue. I think the listening point's really important. And with regards to staff networks, what I call your tempered radicals, the people that feel brave enough to talk about what's happening, they should be considered as jewels for your organisation, because they are reflecting back to you the staff experience. So thank you for sharing that. I have a question here from an audience member. What practically might inclusion of race equality on the board assurance framework look like? How it will be articulated, what it exposes, risk assessments, etc. Who would like to take that from our panel members?
Yeah, I don't mind having a go, and bringing in the last point too, because it all entails how do you move the dial. And I mean, I have to say that if I was on one of the governing bodies, I'd say that on race, the NHS is in crisis. I mean, many of you won't say it, but I'll say it. I'll say it. Because when you look at the hierarchy, when you look at the fact that most people don't think you're dealing with race equality, there is a crisis of almost inertia. I mean, Chris, I think it's great that some senior people are listening, but people really want action. People really want to see change. I remember a few years ago when the data of Black, Asian, minority ethnic executives was 2 out of 270. I think in 4 years that's moved to 6, 8, 2 Black people. I mean, really? I mean, that's glacial progress, glacial. Are you happy with that? It's a question. Are you happy with that? And if you're not, you need an action plan, not for 10 years or 20 years. You need to start delivering now. What are we saying here? What are we saying? There's no talent. After 60 years of Black people being in the NHS, there's no talent that can percolate up. You've got to start removing those barriers. You've got to start seeing talent, helping it have a pathway with urgency. You know, the thing is about it, I'm getting a bit cross now because I hear words. My mother came in the 60s and gave her best years to the NHS. She struggles now with a bad back because back then you lifted people in and out of beds. And all these years later, progress is almost non-existent. And it's not just about internally, but externally. Because of race inequality, people died. People are suffering. And I'm sorry to want to be forced to have to shake you again. But I'm impatient. And I don't want to see plans for 20 years. I don't want to see glacial progress. We can do better than that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit frustrated. I'm getting a bit frustrated because, you know, I see surveys and see plans. I want to see action.
Thank you, Lord Willie, and you know, really important to talk about the action and the lack of action and the urgency and the patient outcomes as well. Does anyone else want to come in with regards to the board assurance framework?
Yes, I can come in. Hello, thank you. So I suppose it's the way that you use the board assurance framework for all sort of your strategic risks. It's about being clear in terms of what risk you're trying to address, and then what your sort of assurances and your mitigation is, and a clear plan that needs to be interrogated through your subcommittees. But I also then think, like I said, there's something about how you look at it in relation to your other risks, your clinical risks, so it's not just your staffing risk, so it goes only to the people committee. It's everything. So thinking about how is race impacting on the rest of the challenges that you are facing. I suppose to touch on, I think your earlier question is also thinking about there's a responsibility for external bodies as well in terms of how we are viewed, how we are regulated, and how we are rated. The race issue needs to be given the same level of importance when we're looking at the well-led domain, for instance, because how can you be outstanding or good if you're ultimately failing your staff and your service users based on the color of their skin? Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And I think you've raised a really good point there about cross-referencing data. So zooming out from just individual committees, but comparing your incidents, your recruitment and retention, you know, your all the data that you have in every single committee, looking at actually which are the groups that are affected, you know, your complaints, your grievances, your disciplinaries. But I think there's also something about what is put onto risk registers, you know, how much is race equality embedded there, and aligning to, you know, you're signing off the NHS Constitution that, you know, it's equality is important and it's happening, but actually is it? And thinking about the governance around that. So thank you for raising that point around actually cross-referencing, really thinking about your data differently and how that insurance happens. I have a question here from the audience member about they're on a journey as a board, and how can they sort of further be supported to get it right and act confidently and competently? Any tools and resources for support?
Shall I have a go at that, Manisha?
Thank you.
So I think number one is know that you need the help, identify what help, and then look to external facilitation. There are a lot of good companies that will help with the conversation. So it's about having the conversation at board level first, identifying who feels what, how far each individual's on their journey, which will then inform your board reaction to this agenda. And if not everybody's aligned, not much is going to change, because as Manisha just alluded to and Lorraine, each subcommittee needs to be talking about race and culture, regardless of its terms of reference. That conversation needs to happen at every subcommittee, then it needs to go to audit committee, and then it needs to go back to the board. So if the board are in the right place, it becomes usual board and subcommittee business, and then you can hold each other to account. So it might be that an individual board needs some training, some help, some reflection time to really think about its values and what it's been talking about, whether the conversations have been right. So I would say draw on outside sources, also have the staff network come and speak to you. They'll tell you what's required and what's needed to give the focus. And then to have sources of individual reading, educational tools, online videos, there's all and so much available. And I'm hoping that this is where NHS providers will come in, because we need a repository of best practice, of evidence, to help individuals and to help boards just check in and see where they are. So I think that really helps. You know, programs of work that work deeply over a year with a set of people moving through the organisation, starting with the board, going to the exec, then moving through the middle management, where lots of the changes need to be made. So I would suggest those sorts of things.
Thank you, Sim. Hopefully the panel are okay to go over for a few minutes if we have some extra questions, so please submit. I have a question for the panel. I think sometimes the patient voice is missing in this. The NHS, as far as I know at the moment, having recently left a year ago, doesn't really scrutinise any patient experience or data about race equality. You know, who's looking at when patients report experiences of racism or discrimination, but who's actually asking? And I think if you think about, you know, being part of a community, a very diverse community, personally, there are open secrets in your local communities about how Black and brown communities, patients, experience their local NHS trust. And there will be stories that are shared and a lack of trust. So I'd just like to open it up to the panel to think about what needs to happen to really embed that patient voice into terms of race equality and what they're experiencing.
Can I go?
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think the ICSs have got a big part to play in this in relation to working with the community, not doing things to the communities, but working with communities and really thinking about the different groups and the different needs. We're fortunate enough that we're part of the pilot of the patient care race equality framework that we're doing with NHS England, and we're one of the first 4 trusts in the country, 2 of them in London, that are part of this. And I think this is something that will really push us to look at our patient and carer data and making sure that we are responding and accountable to their experience based on the race as well. And I think it's similar. Everything that we're doing for staff and the attention we pay, you have to match it with patients. You cannot address one without the other. So again, linked to what we were saying relating to boards' responsibilities, you also have to listen to your service users, and then you have to co-produce to make sure that we meet their needs. We often talk about hard to reach communities. They're not hard to reach. We are hard to access. So we need to stop trying to fix them, but we need to fix our services to make sure that they cater for everyone. As we've all talked about the NHS Constitution, it was really clear that it's for everyone, not just some groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And thank you for raising that important point about actively engaging with communities and making the effort to do that. I'm conscious of time, that a couple of panel members all need to finish at 12. Is there any last final points that anyone would like to raise before we wrap up? Chris, over to you.
Just two very quick points. Firstly, I really love Lorraine's point about stop talking about hard to reach communities, actually make yourself easier to access. Absolutely great way of thinking about it. And just to answer Simon's point, I completely agree with Simon about the need for really concrete planning, and certainly the way we're doing it is to combine 2 points that have been made just on our journey to share where we're up to. Is we're working at the moment on a really clear anti-racism statement that we will put on our website, and we're then following that up very quickly afterwards with a really detailed action plan of what we want to do over the next 6 months, year and a half, 2 years. And we will, again, very deliberately make that public so that we can be challenged on A, is the plan ambitious enough? And B, are we actually delivering it? And I do think that there is that bright light of public accountability. If you A, put out a public statement, but also B, then develop a really clear plan, that's a really good way that, in a sense, helps you be held to account because it's public.
Thank you, Chris. I think just like to thank all of our panel speakers and to our audience members who submitted questions. From everything I've heard today, if I thought about it sequentially, there is something about, firstly, the board thinking about the whys and getting a real clear, truthful picture of what's happening, but then having the courage and the motivation and the drive to think about, let's discuss this, let's think about how we need to act, and making that commitment, public commitment to your staff about how we're going to embed race equality into our governance process, how we're going to be held to account, how we're going to be active listeners, how we're going to engage with the community. And there is a real urgency, a real sense of urgency that we need to act now, and listening to the staff and getting the staff perspective on that. There's a lot of work to do. I'm hoping that this journey with NHS providers will also provide some useful resources and insight for our NHS Trust. But I really thank you all for all your points and some really important ideas and suggestions raised. So thank you all to all the panel.